The man known to history as William Wilberforce was born in the English town of Hull, located in the East Riding of Yorkshire, on the 24th of August 1759. Wilberforce's father, Robert, was a merchant, and a successful one at that, having built up the family fortune that had been first developed by his own father, William. Young William Wilberforce knew that his grandfather, William, had built a successful shipping business sending British products to the Baltic nations of Russia, Sweden, and Prussia in exchange for goods such as lumber, mineral ores, and hemp. Wilberforce's grandfather had moved the family residence to Hull, the fourth largest port city in England, located in the northeast of the kingdom. A bustling port that owed much of its economic growth to the expansion of the British Empire, William constructed a mansion near the River Hull where the Wilberforce family ships brought in the valuable trade goods from the Scandinavian nations. His grandfather's business success likely helped his election to city alderman, and later to the city's mayor in 1745, where he threw his energies into improving the city and raising his children. William's father, Robert, had been born in 1728, at a time when the Kingdom of Great Britain had recently been formed from the separate kingdoms of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland under Hanoverian kings. Hanoverian success stemmed largely from the political genius of Prime Minister and Whig leader Robert Walpole, who had helped transform Britain from a struggling backwater nation to a competitive imperial power. Banking, commerce, and industry flourished in Great Britain, particularly as vast revenues began to flow into imperial coffers from the Caribbean islands, which were largely run by enslaved Africans. With Britain's empire expanding as Great Britain began contesting France and other European powers for supremacy in the New World, the Wilberforce family trade only continued to grow. When Robert Wilberforce came of age, he joined his father as a managing partner in 1755 and continued to guide the family business towards greater success. Robert lived until 1768, thus missing most of his son's major life achievements. William's mother, Elizabeth Bird, was originally from London and had married Robert on the 18th of October 1755. Her family, like her husband's, was involved in business ventures in the expanding British Empire. Her family remained close to her as she moved to Hull to live with her new husband. She gave birth to 3 daughters prior to the birth of her son, William. Only 2 of the daughters, Elizabeth and Sarah, survived birth. Out of all her children, only 2 survived to adulthood, her daughter Sarah and her son, William. It was William who would earn the family its greatest prestige and fame. She died in 1798, thus seeing her son begin his anti-slavery efforts. William Wilberforce was a sickly child, and some likely wondered if he would survive beyond childhood. Not only was he frequently sick, but he was also small for his age and had poor eyesight. Luckily for Wilberforce, he was spared the grueling existence that the lower classes of Great Britain endured that likely would have killed him. Growing up the son of a rich merchant and city mayor had significant advantages. Unlike other children in the region who were forced to work to help provide for their families, William had the opportunity to go to school and develop his quick intellect and use the abundant energy that inhabited his sickly frame. He first attended Hull Grammar School in 1767 at age 8. However, the next year, William's life was upended by the death of his father. His mother sent him to live with his aunt and uncle, Hannah and William Wilberforce, at their estate of Wimbledon Villa in Surrey. While living with his aunt and uncle, William also spent considerable time at his relative's second home at St. James's Place in London. During the school year, he was sent to a boarding school in Putney, about 3 miles away. It was a small school, and William learned the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, and other subjects. He disliked the schoolmaster and longed for vacation time. It was during this period of his life that William became acquainted with evangelical messages being preached by a new generation of ministers. His extended family had become interested in the newly growing movement that would later become Methodism, and these interactions would have a profound impact on Wilberforce. He loved listening to the minister John Newton, a parson at Olney in Buckinghamshire who frequently preached in London. Wilberforce looked up to the ex-sea captain and slave trader who enthralled his audience with his stories of his time at sea and spending time in Africa. Elizabeth Wilberforce soon noticed that her son was sounding increasingly like a Methodist. For a woman who was religious but raised in a culture that looked down on enthusiasm or anything that was not rational, William's growing affinity towards Methodism came as a shock. She reacted swiftly, bringing the young William back to Hull, which broke the boy's heart. His stay in Hull was brief, as he was sent to Pocklington, a town some 24 miles to the north, to attend school where he was instructed in a classical education. While at first William remained firmly committed to Methodist principles, his family's sustained criticism and efforts to involve him in Hull's high society began shifting his beliefs to align more with Anglican views. As a young teen, William became a frequent patron of the local theatre and was involved in most social activities among the aristocracy and the elites of Hull. He developed a reputation as a good singer and was known for his fiery but jovial personality. He also became incredibly wealthy following the death of his grandfather, who passed away in 1774. William's life took a new direction when, in October of 1776, just months after the American colonies had declared their independence from Great Britain, he enrolled as a student at Cambridge, specifically at St. John's College. Only 17 years old, Wilberforce immediately surrounded himself with other young men who focused more of their attention on gambling than on their studies. Luckily, Wilberforce passed his exams due to his quick memory and sharp intellect, though in later years he came to regret the wasted opportunity he had let slip away due to his focus on gambling and entertainment. Yet, at 17, such thoughts were far from his mind. Wilberforce spent much of his energy on amusement, yet still gained a reputation as one of the brightest at the college, in part due to his ability to pass tests despite his terrible study habits. Though not known for his physical attributes, he was only 5'3" and was said to have an ugly face, Wilberforce was exceptionally popular and often distracted his fellow classmates from their own studies. Though William avoided heavy drinking and sexual misconduct, he remained the life of the party, his wit and cheerful demeanour winning friends wherever he went. However, Wilberforce was unhappy, and by his second year had left some of the wilder circles at Cambridge. Still, he was known as a carefree and idle student, well versed in the classics, but lacking in the habits that would lead to greatness. He was also rich, and became even richer in 1777, when his beloved uncle died. During his studies, William began to plan his rise in society, which he believed would be achieved through the realm of politics. While his cousins managed the family business, Wilberforce spent the years of 1778 and 1779 visiting friends and studying at Cambridge. It was during this time at Cambridge that Wilberforce first met William Pitt the Younger, the son of the famous MP, now Lord William Pitt, who a decade earlier had triumphantly led the British Empire to its complete victory over the French Empire during the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. Unlike Wilberforce, Pitt was far more studious and serious. Despite the differences, the two young men developed a deep and lasting friendship that would remain an important part of Wilberforce's life. In the winter of 1779 and 1780, Wilberforce and the younger Pitt would go together to watch the debates raging in Parliament. While watching the debates, Wilberforce began to plot his election to the House of Commons and in 1780 began canvassing for support among the electors of Hull. Wilberforce's charm and his spending of the modern equivalent of almost £2 million on his campaign proved sufficient to help him win in a landslide victory over the two other candidates, thus landing Wilberforce a seat in the House of Commons. While certainly his money had helped his case, it was his personality that drew many of the local freemen to him. Wilberforce entered Parliament on the 31st of October 1780 at the age of 21. He was soon joined by his friend William Pitt, who was elected in January 1781. Together, the two young men began a process of transforming the British Empire. In Parliament, William Wilberforce was a decided independent, refusing to align with either the Tories or the Whigs. During his first year in Parliament, he spoke seldom, was almost always present, and learned as much as he could of the procedure and methods of the House. He also spent considerable time in the famous clubs frequented by the men of the British government, including White's and Brooke's. There he played cards and gambled against the upper echelons of the upper classes of England, fully aware that in order for the son of a merchant to succeed in a parliament filled with the aristocracy and landed gentry, he needed to be seen as one of them. He also made friends with other young bachelors in the parliament and would frequent operas, plays, and other carefree locations in London. While companions also frequented the local brothels, Wilberforce, despite his lapse in evangelical beliefs, kept from those institutions, although legend suggests that he did take coffee at a local brothel in the mornings. During this period, Wilberforce was unconcerned about the African slave trade. His priorities focused on his life of pleasure and the matters before Parliament. He had more principles than most, but by and large, Wilberforce was a man of the time, hardly exceptional from the dozens of other young, ambitious men crowding Parliament's benches. As the American Revolution ended, taking with it Prime Minister Lord North's administration, Wilberforce hoped that the new government would include him in the inner circle of power. However, despite his deep love of Britain, Wilberforce was considered not suited for a cabinet position due to his inefficiency at organisation. Despite the snub, his good friend William Pitt had risen and become part of the cabinet. After his rise to power, Pitt continued to consult Wilberforce on challenges facing the administration, thus, to all intents and purposes, making him a part of the cabinet. Both Wilberforce and Pitt were surprised when George III, in an effort to outmaneuver some of his enemies in Parliament, offered Pitt the premiership in 1783, which he declined, thus resulting in Pitt stepping down from the cabinet. With Pitt no longer in the cabinet, Wilberforce and his friends celebrated the return of their friend who had for so long been occupied by government business. It was as if the young men were children again, laughing and running through the grounds of Wilberforce's estate near London. The next several months were rather carefree for Wilberforce and his friends. Rejecting efforts of friends to marry him off, Wilberforce instead travelled to France with Pitt and some other friends. The adventure was perfect for the carefree group of parliamentarians. The war, now over, allowed for Wilberforce to tour his nation's chief rival, visiting the royal family and meeting the coquettish Marie Antoinette. However, the young men's adventure in France was cut short when Pitt was recalled to England on urgent business. The pair of friends returned to find Parliament in an uproar over what was called Fox's India Bill. Charles James Fox, the primary author of the bill, had for decades been a thorn in the side of George III. A colourful politician in the Whig Party with exceptionally loose moral standards, Fox had risen to power during the American Revolution as a staunch supporter of the Americans, decrying the king as a tyrant. In 1782, he served as a member of the cabinet as Foreign Secretary and many believed was preparing the India Bill, a bill which would transfer control of the East India Company to a government-appointed board of directors as a means of creating a powerful patronage network that would give Fox hegemonic control of Parliament. King George III, a strict moral man, despised Fox, who he viewed as not only a political enemy, but also the man who had corrupted his son's morals. As Parliament raged over the bill, Pitt and Wilberforce entered the scene to deliver harsh speeches denouncing the bill. Eventually, the bill failed, leading to the collapse of Fox's governing coalition. In its place, George III placed the burden of the premiership on the 24-year-old William Pitt. While Pitt avoided bringing his close friend into the cabinet, he continued to rely on Wilberforce's support. Wilberforce delivered witty and bombastic speeches, raking the more senior Charles Fox through the political mud. Wilberforce was quickly making a name for himself as a witty and bitingly sarcastic debater whose ability to needle and irk his rivals knew no bounds. Wilberforce, in these particular debates, derided his opponents as those who sought to destroy the traditional form of English governance. Though he retained his independence during these years, Wilberforce was more or less aligned with the King's party. While defending his friend's government and the King, Wilberforce began planning another audacious scheme that he believed would place him in the spotlight. He would run for a seat in Yorkshire, one of the most powerful seats in Parliament. Wilberforce, in the spring of 1784, threw his energy and funds into the contest, giving speeches and using his full arsenal of charm on the populace of the city of York. It was an uphill battle, particularly since Wilberforce was relatively unknown in the region prior to his efforts to win a seat in a heavily pro-Fox area. Despite Fox's popularity, Wilberforce proved to be an expert campaigner and crushed his rivals. The victory shocked Fox and his allies and set the tone of the general elections then occurring in favour of the Pitt administration. Many attributed Wilberforce's victory to his skills as an orator. Called a shrimp by some, nevertheless, Wilberforce skillfully wove together ideas in his speeches that left his audience enthralled. Unlike many other contemporaries, Wilberforce was skilled at examining multiple sides in debates while establishing the supremacy of his own position. Still an independent, Wilberforce at times frustrated his closest allies when his convictions led him to vote against those he generally sided with. Now, with a powerful seat, Wilberforce continued to revel in the power of Parliament. Known for his carefree and cheerful disposition, many also recognized that his sarcasm could be levelled quickly in a debate with devastating eloquence, thus making Wilberforce many enemies. William seemed poised to ascend the political ladder, having won one of the most prestigious house seats in England and being close friends with one of the most powerful men in the country. If he had been overlooked before, now Wilberforce was seen and viewed as a viable leader. At this moment of power and success, Wilberforce experienced one of the most significant events of his life while touring the European continent with his family in late 1784. Accompanied by his mother, sister, and several others, the party crossed the English Channel to France in October. One of the party, a man named Isaac Milner, during their travels began debate with Wilberforce over the concept of Methodism, in part after Wilberforce's jabs at the religion. Wilberforce was considered religious by his peers, though later in life he recalled that such a designation was more of an indication of the religiosity of the upper classes in the 1780s than of his personal religiousness. Wilberforce, who had long ago left behind his attraction to Methodism, mocked what he considered to be foolishness and enthusiasm. He felt Methodism to be a relic of a superstitious age and had himself shifted towards a Unitarian belief system, one which denied the divinity of Christ while acknowledging the reality of a creator God. Yet his companion, a brilliant mathematician and scientist, refused to budge, as Wilberforce mocked evangelism. In early 1785, Wilberforce, at the urging of Pitt, who soon planned to bring up important bills for parliamentarian reform, began his travels home, accompanied by Milner. Along the route home, the men read and discussed a small book entitled The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul by Philip Doddridge. Published in 1745, the book was eloquent and well-reasoned in Wilberforce's mind, and from the conversations he had with Milner, he began to find himself shifting his religious views again closer to the childhood beliefs he had long ago abandoned. Later, Wilberforce viewed that trip and the conversations with Milner as critical in the development of his faith. But in the moment, it was merely an interesting series of discussions rather than a world-shattering event. Upon his return to England, Wilberforce laid aside his musings on theology and set himself back to his life in Parliament. When Pitt's bill for parliamentary reform failed after a few months of work, Wilberforce and his friend Milner returned to the continent, the whole while discussing theology. Wilberforce gradually found himself convinced of the message Milner shared, particularly as the two studied the Greek New Testament and conversed about various ideas in Christianity. When Wilberforce's party returned to England in the fall of 1785, William found himself at war with himself. On the one hand, he now believed in Jesus Christ and the ideas proposed in Methodism. He had begun to pray again, and felt deep remorse for the life he had pursued as a politician. However, he was also afraid of losing it all. Wilberforce felt trapped between his dreams of becoming a powerful politician and his conviction that he must devote his life to Christ. In the midst of these deep internal debates, Wilberforce decided to withdraw from the world of Parliament, convinced that he needed to devote his life to Christ. Pitt was flabbergasted and debated his friend on the merits of his conversion, something Pitt viewed as a descent into superstition. Wilberforce, in turn, sought to convert Pitt. Neither were successful. As Wilberforce changed his lifestyle, even riding in a common coach to his home instead of a private carriage, he remained unsure what to do. He turned to his boyhood hero, the old sailor-turned-preacher John Newton. Though surrounded by what he later described as 10,000 doubts, Wilberforce spoke with the now 60-year-old rector in his London home in December of 1785. The advice of the old minister broke the logjam in Wilberforce's mind. The man suggested that Wilberforce remain a devoted follower of Christ and a politician. Several years later, Newton wrote, "It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation." The 26-year-old Wilberforce transformed by his religious conversion, was determined to now find the purpose for which God had placed him in Parliament. Throughout the year of 1786, Wilberforce sought to not only deepen his education, which he felt he had woefully neglected as a young man, but also sought to understand his new faith. Wilberforce was constantly thinking and writing about ways to improve himself, his papers laden with religious musings and discussions of his failings. However, Wilberforce was convinced that despite his failings, the Christianity he had embraced was one of joy and hope. The blending of his longing to become a more devout follower of Jesus Christ with his life as a politician became central to Wilberforce's actions and thoughts. This religious dedication naturally informed his view of politics. Rather than a game to be played, politics were now a portion of his life that would fall beneath the watchful eye of Jesus Christ, and Wilberforce was determined to not let him down. Though his health had turned worse, in part a result of his repeated fasts, Wilberforce's energy seemed boundless. He sponsored a bill on criminal reform and another on parliamentary reform, two subjects that were important to him throughout his life, and, despite their defeat, continued to plan ways to reshape England. However, his most lasting legacy was still on the horizon. It was in the fall of 1786 that he would receive a letter from his friend Sir Charles Middleton, an MP for Rochester, that would change the course of his life forever. Middleton was an evangelical Christian similar to Wilberforce and a former sailor. In his letter to William, he sought to have Wilberforce bring up the slave trade in Parliament. Slavery had long been a part of the lifeblood of the British Empire, enabling massive profits to be gained in the Caribbean through the sweat, blood and lives of enslaved Africans. The sugar lobby and the slave trading lobby in London were some of the most powerful in the empire, and few were inclined to interfere with a trade that seemed essential for Britain's prosperity and health. However, on both sides of the Atlantic, a combination of religious zeal and Enlightenment ideals led a growing number of individuals to renounce slavery. Middleton and his family had encouraged several anti-slavery activists, including James Ramsay, a former sailor turned preacher who had lived for a time in the sugar colonies himself, and Thomas Clarkson, a soon-to-be famous abolitionist, to continue their attacks on slavery. The Middletons, however, recognized the need to move the matter from the public square to the halls of Parliament, where they believed real action could be accomplished. Some biographers state that it was Lady Middleton who helped push her husband to write to Wilberforce and seek his aid in attacking the trade. During the winter of 1786 to 1787, Wilberforce began meeting with the Middletons more frequently, as well as with other anti-slavery activists such as Thomas Clarkson. He also conversed with people most connected to slavery, such as the West Indian merchants and some members of Parliament. Unsuspecting of Wilberforce's intentions, they shared openly about the trade and the dangers of abolition. It was through these discussions that Wilberforce himself became a die-hard abolitionist. He later told the House of Commons, "I confess to you, so enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did the slave trade's wickedness appear, that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. Let the consequences be what they would, I, from this time, determined that I would never rest until I had effected its abolition." However, before Wilberforce launched his attack on slavery, he first began to push for a reform of morals in England during the year of 1787. Believing that the only way England could survive the future was to be a thorough Christian and moral nation, Wilberforce was deeply troubled by the hypocrisy of many elites as well as what he saw as the moral degradation of the lower classes. He was troubled by many of his fellow elites who attacked the morality of the lower sorts, while they themselves wasted away their lives in revelries and worldly affairs. Wilberforce was not overwhelmed, however, and believed that the situation could be rectified by changing the elite's behaviours, which would in turn impact the common man. Ever a believer in the potential good of his fellow humans, Wilberforce worked with various religious and political leaders to establish societies that would help to strengthen the moral underpinnings of British society. Wilberforce did not want to force change, but believed that a good example would promote change rapidly. During this period, he stated in his journal, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." It was in the spring of 1787, near an oak tree with his friend William Pitt and future Prime Minister William Grenville, that Wilberforce, after a conversation with Pitt, decided it was time to act openly against slavery. Wilberforce was well aware that a complete destruction of slavery would be difficult to achieve in one fell swoop, and also believed that an immediate emancipation would be disastrous for both black and white peoples of the Caribbean. Instead, Wilberforce and many of his allies who were helping to shape his ideas believed that dismantling the slave system bit by bit would result in more sustainable success. Wilberforce and many other abolitionists believed that by first attacking the slave trade, it would force masters to treat their slaves better, instead of as cheap, replaceable objects. Though freeing the enslaved was the ultimate goal, improving their lives prior to that point was also a goal. Wilberforce was not alone in working towards abolitionism. He had friends outside of Parliament working tirelessly to shift public opinion and to direct the growing abolition movement. He also had friends in Parliament adding their skills to the fray, helping to give political capital to a fragile endeavour. Wilberforce added his excitement and drive that helped provide the energy required to maintain the movement. In 1787, Wilberforce and his allies sought to secure international cooperation in ending the slave trade by pushing British officials in Paris to seek French cooperation. Wilberforce corresponded with French officials, sharing the horrors of the slave trade and countering claims from pro-slavery writers that most Africans sent to the Americas were criminals. Wilberforce relied heavily on the writings of American Quaker and abolitionist Anthony Benezet in articulating his point. He was confident that the British Parliament would soon abolish the slave trade, mistakenly believing that the justice of the proposition would entice Parliament to abolish slavery altogether. A few days after Christmas Day of 1787, William Wilberforce sent notice to the House of Commons that during the next session he would move to abolish the slave trade. Several prominent members, including Wilberforce's former enemy Charles Fox, applauded the decision. Wilberforce believed and suggested to many that there is no doubt of our success. He could not have been more wrong. Wilberforce and his allies mobilized their supporters across Britain, bringing in over 30 petitions by early January from various towns and cities across the country. Presses were rapidly selling abolitionist literature throughout England, further producing public excitement at the idea. Wilberforce was confident. However, his efforts to prepare for his motion to abolish the slave trade, as well as spearheading moral reforms in England, took their toll on him. In early February, when Wilberforce had planned to present his motion, he developed a deep sickness that many feared would kill him. For over a month, Wilberforce appeared at death's door. However, a steady prescription of dry opium helped restore him. During this period, though controversial, opium was seen as a valid prescription and useful for healing patients. Wilberforce's physician prescribed dry opium pills that restored Wilberforce to his normal, slightly sickly state. He used opium pills for the rest of his life and suffered some side effects as he aged, such as increased forgetfulness and other symptoms. Yet, as he recovered physically, he struggled with fears of his own worth, fears of addiction to his new medicine, and perhaps fears of starting the crusade against slavery. In the depths of this dark night of the soul, Wilberforce penned a letter to Pitt on the 7th of April 1788, pleading that his friend take over the cause of abolition. On the 9th of May, Pitt obliged his friend and moved that the House of Commons investigate the trade, though he presented the matter in a decidedly neutral manner. Still, though Pitt was managing the fight for abolition in the House, Wilberforce corresponded frequently about the state of the movement, which he considered of utmost importance. He finally returned to Parliament in November of 1788, frail and weak, but determined to win the fight. And a fight it was going to be. Slave traders and slave owners and their investors now recognized the threat that Wilberforce and his fellow abolitionists posed. No longer an outspoken fringe movement, abolitionists had gained decided political capital in Great Britain. From the fall of 1788 through to the spring of 1789, Wilberforce and his allies prepared their defense of abolition so as to make the evidence overwhelming in favor of ending the slave trade. On the 5th of May 1789, Wilberforce delivered his first speech in favor of ending the trade. He spoke for 3.5 hours. His speech designed to appeal to his listeners, the House of Commons, all of whom were elite men of high standing. His speech was moderate, Wilberforce believing that fire and brimstone would not drive home his point as effectively as demonstrating the logical need for abolition. Though he rallied some powerful allies, including the powerful orator Edmund Burke, many were wary of the proposition of even hindering the slave trade, for fear that such an action would decimate the power of the British Empire. On the 23rd of June 1789, the House of Commons laid aside Wilberforce's plan to end the slave trade, declaring there was not enough evidence to support the measure. Wilberforce returned to the Commons in January of 1790 and recommenced the battle for abolition of the slave trade. Time and time again, opponents of the abolition movement tried to trap Wilberforce and suppress the additional evidence he planned to present. Wilberforce sidestepped and outmaneuvered his opponents and was able to produce over 10,000 folio pages of evidence by June of 1790, though these pages would tragically be lost in a fire in 1834. Overwhelmingly elected again in June, Wilberforce worked tirelessly to prepare for the parliamentary battles to come that winter, but an unexpected development on the French-controlled island of Saint-Domingue threatened to derail his efforts. When word arrived in the spring of 1791 of a massive slave uprising, rumors began to circulate that the slaves had risen as a result of Wilberforce's efforts. In April of 1791, Wilberforce rose again to debate, ushering in weeks of tumultuous discussion in the House of Commons. Wilberforce, less optimistic than he had been a year previously, listened as his colleagues debated the merits of an end to the slave trade. Many, while acknowledging the righteousness of Wilberforce's claims, feared that any abolition act at the present would cost Britain its entire empire. However, one of the most eloquent defenders of Wilberforce's proposal was Charles Fox, whose speech blasted the enemies of abolition with gusto. Debates lasted until 3:30 a.m. on the 20th of April, 1791. Yet, when the vote was taken, Wilberforce's plan lost by a total of 75 votes. In the debates of 1792, Wilberforce and his allies won a small victory when Parliament overwhelmingly voted in favour of a motion to gradually ban the slave trade. Further debate resolved that the end of the slave trade should occur by 1796. Though Wilberforce desired to end it far sooner, the compromise was enough for him. However, this monumental victory was immediately delayed by the House of Lords, who demanded fresh evidence, thus allowing the enemies of abolition more time to stall and appeal for a longer period of gradual change. Wilberforce recognized now that change would not come quickly, but that it would take a continual attack in order to achieve the final goal of complete emancipation. Though his bill was defeated, Wilberforce remained tireless in working to help those currently and formerly enslaved. He supported the work of abolitionists in founding the colony of Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. The colony was designed to be a refuge for people of African descent to return to Africa and bring with them the culture and ideas of Europeans. Wilberforce, a firm believer in the need to spread Christianity to Africa and the whole world, believed that it could only be accomplished through the work of Europeanized Africans. Wilberforce was entirely opposed to forced conversion or conquest of Africa, believing that Europeans had damaged the continent and owed Africa aid as recompense. Wilberforce believed not only would the colony bring spiritual benefits, but could also open up profitable commercial opportunities for African nations, thus allowing them to benefit from the global system of trade. For the rest of his life, Wilberforce would devote his energy to Sierra Leone. Throughout his work, however, Wilberforce and his friends failed miserably at managing the colony, and his views of the superiority of European civilization won his plan few friends in Africa and have proved problematic for people in the present. However, Wilberforce, despite his biases, believed that a bright future loomed for Africa, and one that would only be benefited by Britain's efforts. While continuously working towards ending the slave trade and while attempting to manage the Sierra Leone colony, Wilberforce watched warily as the French Revolution overtook and remade France. He had little sympathy for radical Englishmen who sought to transform Britain into a new France. However, he did not feel the same fear that his sometime ally Edmund Burke felt for the revolution. Not a pacifist, Wilberforce nevertheless did not like the start of Britain's wars with France in 1793. Not only did he believe that reform efforts of elections and of societal morals would be stalled, but he also witnessed the near reversal of his gains against the slave trade. As attention shifted to stopping the spread of the French Revolution, Wilberforce's enemies readily labelled him a radical and his efforts French-like. Despite the setbacks, Wilberforce declared privately to an abolition-minded friend that he was willing to pursue abolition even if it meant a general insurrection in the British West Indies. He was unwilling to drop his cause despite the mounting opposition to his efforts. His efforts to pass a bill attacking the slave trade with other nations, in Wilberforce's mind at least a partial solution to ending the traffic, narrowly passed the House, but was laid aside in the House of Lords in 1793. Another challenge came to dominate Wilberforce's attention during the 1790s. As the war with France progressed, Wilberforce grew more frustrated with the bloodlust of his countrymen and hoped that the revolution in France could be contained without continued fighting. Wilberforce was willing to fight, but felt the military spirit of Britain had blinded policymakers to other options that could prevent the substantial loss of life. Though he had supported his friend William Pitt as Prime Minister, he grew increasingly disenchanted with his policies, particularly the continuation of the war with France. On the 30th of December 1794, Wilberforce arose from his bench seat and moved that the king try for peace with France and continue the war only if the French proved too bloodthirsty to heed reason and common sense. Wilberforce's speech stunned the House, and most particularly William Pitt, who felt that Wilberforce had attacked the heart of Pitt's policies and had turned against him. The wound was deep, and not only had Wilberforce wounded his friend's pride, but also that of his king's. George III, who had previously welcomed Wilberforce and his crusade against slavery, now became a decided opponent of the MP from Hull. In 1795, in part a result of the king's opposition, the Abolition Bill introduced by Wilberforce was thrown out. Pitt and George III were not the only ones angered at Wilberforce's motion for peace. Many throughout the nation vocalized frustrations that Wilberforce had seemingly joined the unpatriotic opposition and threatened the stability of Britain in a time of crisis. Yet he remained resolute and strengthened his independence from either party, angering Pitt's men and George Fox's followers. He even began to refuse to support patronage, a significant element of a British politician's duty in that period. Though the breach with Pitt quickly healed, through the mediation of close mutual friends, others refused to trust Wilberforce. Many grew even more hostile to Wilberforce when Pitt changed course in the summer of 1795 and sent the French indications that the British were open to peace talks. Some blamed Wilberforce as the cause of this change of heart and believed that he prolonged the war by not allowing the swift conquest of France. Yet, when the French, in the fall of 1795, refused peace, Wilberforce returned to support the war effort once again. As the war escalated, the nation simmered with discontent and riots threatened the stability of the empire. Wilberforce, though a believer in the need for reform and change, did not believe that the path to a brighter future lay in following the French model of revolution. He supported bills that clamped down on protests, arguing that protests should be done through the legal channels established in English tradition. As the debates turned heated, Wilberforce sought to curb his attacks and biting sarcasm. Opposing men such as Fox, he felt constrained, due to his religious convictions, to temper his rebuttals to their proposals in favour of the popular movements swelling in England, though some will surely argue he was, in fact, simply trying to appease allies in his war on slavery. Wilberforce's support for harsh restrictions on the freedom of assembly won him few supporters. Still, Wilberforce remained popular among the voters of the county of York and proved an able defender of the government to his concerned constituents. Throughout this period of defending the government and seeking to advance abolition bills, Wilberforce also continued to advocate for the poor and to aid them through private donations. Though criticized in current literature for his unwillingness to support more radical measures to help the poor and needy of England, Wilberforce was moved by the plight of the poor and wanted practical improvements that were not in the vein of radical Jacobin theory. Wilberforce wanted change, but he detested the mode the French had used, an approach that, in his opinion, had caused far more harm than good and destroyed the morals of France. In 1796, Wilberforce came close to achieving his goal of abolishing the slave trade. Having skillfully shuttled his bill through Parliament, it was on its third reading when an opera ruined its chances of success. The opera, I Due Gobi, was a new Italian play featuring the Italian singer Vignoni, and many in London were anxious to see it performed. On the night of the final vote for Wilberforce's motion, several, perhaps 5 or 6, of his friends were absent from Parliament, attending the opera. His enemies had stayed in the House that night, and, to the horror of Wilberforce, his bill lost by 4 votes. The loss devastated William and perhaps influenced his rapid decline in health. Having had victory seem so close, with favourable prospects of success, only to see it snatched by the worldliness of his friends, was earth-shattering. Wilberforce's friend Isaac Milner rushed to London to help care for his friend. Wilberforce recovered his health, enough to watch other anti-slavery bills he had forwarded lose in dramatic fashion. He had not quit, though rumours constantly circulated after each defeat that he would leave behind the cause, but the stress and long hours spent in lobbying and strategizing had begun to take a toll on him. Wilberforce turned deeper to his religious convictions, which he felt not only pushed him to change and be better, but also gave him hope for a better world. At this moment of deep gloom, a bright moment enveloped and dramatically altered Wilberforce's life. Known to many as a perpetual bachelor, Wilberforce had very little interest in marriage for most of his life. However, all that changed when he met Barbara Spooner. A young evangelical woman, Spooner was the third of 10 children of a rich banker and merchant from Birmingham. She was known for her humour and beauty, though some felt she was not enough for her now famous husband. While friends advised him to slow down, Wilberforce blithely ignored them, proposing only a little over a week after having met Barbara. They were married on the 30th of May, 1797, at the parish church of Walcott, Bath. Wilberforce was 38 and Barbara 20. Together, they would have 6 children in 10 years. Though many viewed the match as below Wilberforce, he was completely smitten with Barbara and deeply in love. Barbara, in turn, loved Wilberforce, though some accused her of possessiveness. She became an anchor in his life, a constant in a sea of shifting alliances and broken dreams. She may have wanted him to stay home more than was expedient for a busy politician, but no one could doubt her loyalty to him and his life's work. Wilberforce loved Barbara with a passion and joy that was readily apparent to all who knew the couple throughout Wilberforce's life. He desperately needed this love as he entered some of his most challenging years in his quest to end the slave trade. 1798 proved to be a hard year for Wilberforce. Tensions in England had mounted as not only had French radicalism seemed to seep across the Channel into England, but the opposition became more pointed in its attacks on the government's oppression of free speech and freedom of religion. Many laws were passed that repressed the lower classes. Wilberforce supported many of these bills, justifying the abuses on the people by believing that they would be better under the British Constitution than any other, and that these measures were aimed at agitators who only looked to profit from the poor. His friendship with Pitt and the trust he placed in his friend's word led Wilberforce to believe that the measures taken were for the best of the country. Wilberforce felt that Pitt was the best disposed to lead Britain through a crisis, and that in failing to support his friend, he threatened the world in its hour of need. He also strongly believed in the structure of the classes, believing it to be natural, though not completely rigid, with individual action impacting on one's station in life to some extent. However, despite these bills, he continued to advocate for the poor in ways that he felt did not threaten the British Constitution, even planning to introduce a wealth tax that would shift onerous burdens from the poor to the elites in society. However, these laws seemed to not go far enough for the poor when the Great Hunger of 1799 to 1800 struck. Devastatingly small harvests created vast amounts of hunger across Britain and threatened the political stability of the realm. Starvation was rampant throughout the realm, and Wilberforce's heart broke seeing such suffering. He struggled with anger against landlords who refused to help their tenants by providing land to plant government-provided potato seeds, and at those that refused to assist his bills which aimed to help the poor while protecting the British form of government. He vented in letters to friends of the callous nature of the British elites. He feared that they would soon reap the whirlwind of revolution unless a dramatic change was enacted. As the new century dawned, the movement for abolition seemed no closer to ending slavery than the day they had started. Pitt, who Wilberforce believed was devotedly committed to abolition, did precious little to help his friend in advancing his cause, repeatedly promising Wilberforce that he would act more decidedly once peace was obtained. Wilberforce grew frustrated but sought to remain patient with Pitt, who he believed at heart was a good man. When Pitt resigned in 1801, Wilberforce was forced to work with Henry Addington, a man who showed little desire to advance any sort of abolition bill. False promises from Addington created further cause for exasperation. Wilberforce made himself further unpopular when, in 1803, he critiqued the ministry and pled for peace to continue between Britain and Napoleon's France, a plea which was ultimately ignored when war erupted between the two nations. Disappointed but still determined, Wilberforce continued to push for the adoption of his abolition bills. Wilberforce was crafty and seemed to have a knack for finding exposures in his enemies' defences. He showed this skill as he helped position pro-slavery supporters against each other. The pro-slavery camp became so divided that a bill abolishing the slave trade was passed in the House of Commons on the 27th of June 1804, only to have it once again languish in the Lords. During these repeated attempts and failures, Wilberforce's dreams were tormented by images of burning African villages and slave gangs, images that caused him great anxiety. However, Wilberforce believed that the tides perhaps could be turning when, in 1805, the British Navy defeated the French at Trafalgar, thus allowing the British complete dominance of the seas. Wilberforce knew that one of the strongest arguments against his bill was the inability of the British Navy to fight both slavery and Napoleon's fleets. Yet at this moment of British naval triumph, Britain's allies were crushed on land. His friend William Pitt was once again Prime Minister and took the news far too hard, some suggesting that the defeat helped lead to his death. Wilberforce was shocked when Pitt died on the 23rd of January 1806, though the death of his friend perhaps proved to be the most beneficial for the abolition movement. The new ministry that took over the government following Pitt's death were far more inclined to act decisively on the slave trade than Pitt had been. Among the cabinet included several foes of slavery, including Lord Grenville and Charles Fox, as well as several other men who detested the institution. These men were as enthusiastic and persistent in attempting to kill slavery as Wilberforce, and he gladly welcomed their appointments. In March of 1806, another man, James Stephen, William Wilberforce's brother-in-law, devised an ingenious legal strategy to finally curb the slave trade. Stephen's plan, rather than attack the slave trade directly, opted to instead attack the neutral ships carrying the slave-produced goods as well as slavers' trade with foreign markets. These neutral ships often sailed to French-controlled Europe, a prospect which few British politicians wanted. Thus, the Foreign Slave Bill of 1807 was born, which prevented slave importations into foreign territories, a major market for British slavers. The Act would attack the industry to make it less profitable and thus, in the minds of the British abolitionists, save more African lives. Introduced by Wilberforce to Grenville and Fox, the two acted decisively and helped shuttle the bill first through the Commons and then on to the Lords, where it passed with little opposition. Wilberforce, who had avoided making the bill appear to be anything other than a necessary war measure, was giddy that policies he had fought for years to achieve were now law. He and his allies sensed that a moment to finally deal a death blow to the slave trade had arrived. As he conferred with his allies and spent time pondering and praying, Wilberforce determined that another man ought to bring forward the abolition bill so that it might finally pass. On the 10th of June 1806, Charles Fox delivered a powerful speech before the House of Commons, proposing a resolution that would set a specific date on the British abolition of the slave trade and that the King should begin working with other nations towards a general abolition of the trade. The resolution won by over 100 votes, and with Lord Grenville's aid was passed through the House of Lords. The abolitionists were not through. Despite the death of Fox, Lord Grenville pushed a bill in the House of Lords that would criminalise the slave trade. Sensing the weakness of the opponents of abolition, who had increasingly fractured in the face of a united abolitionist coalition, Grenville went on the offensive in January of 1807, pushing the bill quickly through the Lords. Wilberforce, ever connecting with anti-slavery-minded individuals throughout the Atlantic world, shared information with fellow members that the American Congress was also nearing a total ban on the Atlantic slave trade. The abolitionists worked tirelessly to persuade and push various members of the House of Lords to vote in favour of the bill. The bill, to the surprise of many, passed with overwhelming support. The battle in the House during the month of February indicated that changes had swept England. Younger members overwhelmingly supported the bill, and historians note that during the proceedings Wilberforce wept for joy. At 4 a.m. on the 24th of February 1807, the majority of the House of Commons, by a vote of 283 to 16, voted in favour of a bill for the abolition of the slave trade. Though the ministry, headed by Grenville, collapsed following disagreements with the King over the treatment of Catholics, Grenville was able to shuttle the bill through the final debates and to the King in the closing hours of his administration. On the 25th of March 1807, the bill for the abolition of the slave trade became law. Following the success of the slave bill, Wilberforce continued his efforts to improve the life of the poor as well as to work towards a general abolition of slavery. Though Wilberforce's independence continued to irk both Whigs and Tories alike, he tended to vote in line with the Tories in the decades following the slave trade bill. He continued to actively participate in various charities and spent time with his children. However, his passion remained focused on slavery. Wilberforce's desire prompted him to lend heavy support to the Africa Institution, a charity designed to improve the life of the enslaved in the Americas as well as the people of Africa. Part of the central mission of the institution was promoting the colony of Sierra Leone, a place from which British manners, religion, and influence could spread. Wilberforce was naive or chose to be ignorant of issues in the grandiose plans hatched by him and his associates, such as the brutality of apprenticeships in Sierra Leone. However, he did change, and at times shifted his stance, such as on apprenticeships due to the counsel from his friends and fellow abolitionists. One thing that did remain constant was his efforts to rally support on both sides of the Atlantic to destroy the remaining British and American slave trades from Africa. Wilberforce began to consider changing his borough from Yorkshire, in part to decrease the intense pressures that kept him occupied for much of the year. Yorkshire was at the heart of the expanding Industrial Revolution, and new laws and numerous letters flowed to Wilberforce's desk. Though he believed the parliamentary election system, which could allow Wilberforce to stand for a rotten borough, was corrupt and in desperate need of reform, he finally accepted the efforts of his cousin Lord Calthorpe, who practically controlled the elections of the two-seat borough of Bramber in Sussex, to obtain him a seat in such an insignificant backwater in 1812. His standing for Bramber came just as his health took a turn for the worse, and he suffered particularly with problems with his back. Wilberforce, after his election, spent far less time in London and Parliament, in part as a result of his poor health. Still, he kept seeking to learn, and he dedicated time to learning more about India and supporting Christian missionary efforts there. Wilberforce believed forced conversions to be antithetical to Christianity, and instead advocated missionaries being allowed to work in India. He also continued to correspond with friends throughout Europe, pressing for other European nations to also ban the slave trade. He opposed the peace treaty with France in 1814 on the grounds it did not require an immediate abolition of the slave trade. Following the defeat of Napoleon once and for all in 1815, Wilberforce pursued a registry bill which would require all slaves in British colonies to be registered, so as to prevent smuggling of new slaves into the colonies. In 1816, Wilberforce was broadly attacked in the press and in the Commons when a slave revolt in Barbados erupted. Though it was quickly put down, slaveholders looked to embarrass Wilberforce and repel his attacks on slavery. They constantly accused him of caring more for the African-descended slaves than for the white slaves in England, or, in other words, the labouring poor. This racialized argument was potent in the wake of Wilberforce's support of the Corn Laws, something he supported based on his economic views that opposed free trade. He believed the words of men he trusted as to the conditions of the factories, rather than seeing these conditions for himself. Wilberforce believed himself to be firmly on the side of the poor, though his good intentions in retrospect can be seen as having a negative effect. He was wary of political agitators, seeing in them the embers of French radicalism, particularly when some radicals denounced Christianity. He believed the radicals used anti-religious sentiment to corrupt and destroy progress. Though he was a firm advocate for personal religious liberty, he opposed the British state relinquishing its connection to organized religion, which he saw as necessary to connect the people, at least minimally, to God. He wanted reforms, not revolution. As conflicts raged in England over how best to help the poor, Wilberforce was also battling with family problems. His eldest son, William, appeared to the elder Wilberforce to be idle and self-indulgent, two traits Wilberforce abhorred. William's indulgences while in college worried his father, who feared William Jr. was rapidly becoming lazy and useless. Wilberforce had his son suspended from college and sent him to live with a family friend. Though the arrangement broke Wilberforce's heart, he believed keeping his son away from home would be best. His son showed some signs of reform in 1818 and married a woman Wilberforce considered to be an appropriate match. His fears, at least for the moment, subsided about his eldest. However, Wilberforce was struggling with his personal finances, having decreased rents and given enough money to other causes that he needed to scale back his own expenses. Though not nearly as lavish as many of his peers, Wilberforce still owned several large homes and one country estate. By the 1820s, he was scaling back and sold some of his homes and lands. Ever sickly, he thought at this time of leaving Parliament. However, he could not leave without knowing who would lead the charge to free the enslaved in the British colonies. He looked for members of Parliament he believed could be capable of bearing the load he had carried for several decades. He found many young disciples willing and ready to accept the burden their mentor had carried for so long. Though progress seemed to be moving forward with British efforts to convince the rest of the Western world to end the slave trade, a bill for general emancipation had stalled. Wilberforce felt deep guilt in being unable to advance the bill. He was convinced that, except for the mercy of Jesus Christ, he would be condemned for having failed to save the enslaved. He felt deep shame at the mistakes he felt he had made during earlier debates that he believed had prolonged the years of legal slavery. Burdened with guilt, he continued to author pamphlets advocating for the rights of the enslaved. While grappling with this guilt, the new favourite attack of the pro-slavery part continued to be that Wilberforce cared nothing for the poor of England, an accusation which intensely grated on him. Decades of efforts to reform the penal system, voting laws, and poor laws were disregarded by his opponents. Yet he refused to back down. He and his allies across the British Empire increased their efforts to shift the tide, just as they had done in 1808. Despite a worsening physical condition, Wilberforce was back in Parliament to debate the cause of emancipation. He had decided it would be his last Parliament and that he would no longer stand for re-election. Feeling himself less helpful to the cause, he decided it was time to step back and aid it through other means. Wilberforce spent his remaining years in the countryside with his family, watching with pride as his 3 middle sons devoted their lives to religion. His daughter, Lizzie, caused deep concern when she fell in love with a West Indian slaveholder, though that romance soon faded. His eldest continued to struggle to find anything to occupy his time. Now in his 60s, Wilberforce looked older due to the various diseases ravaging his body. He focused more intently on spreading his religious convictions and even built a church in 1829 for the people who worked his estate. That estate was soon sold as Wilberforce divested himself of larger sums of his childhood fortune. In 1833, Wilberforce became ecstatic, believing that Parliament was nearing a general emancipation of all slaves in the British Empire after he received important information from his allies in Parliament. Parliament had shifted in part due to large slave uprisings in Jamaica and other British possessions that threatened the empire's stability. Wilberforce was hopeful, and he wrote to friends encouraging them to remove any mention of apprenticeship in the new laws. The lessons of Sierra Leone seared in Wilberforce's memory. He returned to London in early July in time to hear the 3rd and final reading of the Abolition Bill. For Wilberforce, the event was one he had feared he would never see. After the passage of the bill on the 25th of July 1833, Wilberforce exclaimed, "Thank God that I have lived to witness a day in which England is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." His dream had been achieved. 4 days later, on the 29th of July 1833, William Wilberforce succumbed to his various illnesses and died at 3 a.m. Wilberforce, one of the few people to have dedicated his life to the eradication of slavery, was gone, but his legacy was just beginning. Only a few hours after his death, members of Parliament contacted the family requesting that Wilberforce be buried in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of the country's greatest individuals. Following his death, his sons Robert and Samuel published a biography of their father that further increased Wilberforce's fame, though it angered some of his friends who saw the sons slighting Wilberforce's allies' efforts. For almost a century, Wilberforce remained a hero in the history of anti-slavery until, in the 1940s, a historian, Eric Williams, degraded Wilberforce's and other abolitionists' efforts as merely profit-motivated. This theory has since been rejected by many historians, however. There remains no solid consensus on Wilberforce, some emphasizing his humanitarian efforts, while others attack his conservative nature and slowness in fighting for the radical lower classes. Yet few can deny that Wilberforce played a critical role in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Furthermore, it can be noted that William Wilberforce's efforts, combined with the work of countless other good-willed abolitionists, transformed the political culture of Great Britain, making a once pro-slavery nation into a decidedly anti-slavery state that was tireless in its efforts to promote abolitionism. During Wilberforce's lifetime, anti-slavery gained increased popularity among the common people of Britain, as well as many of Britain's elites. Many supported the Abolition Act of 1807, and old ideas that slavery was antithetical to British identity began to be more pronounced in many political circles. When the 1833 mass emancipation was passed into law, mass meetings celebrating the end of slavery were held. Newspaper articles and pamphlets lauded the change in Britain's system of government. While slavery continued in parts of the empire, a new and growing fervour had grown to end this practice. The end of slavery led to the collapse of numerous British sugar plantations and the failure of numerous banks that had invested heavily in this slave-produced product. For many Britons, it was a price worth paying to end the foul system. Activists continued to direct the power of the state in helping to end slavery across the globe. While portions of the British populace supported overseas slavery, particularly those connected to the cotton trade, the vast majority of British citizens supported the efforts of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society that had been formed in 1839. The society pressed the British government to expend greater resources in hunting down and capturing slavers, as well as in pressuring other nations to abandon slavery. British warships became the bane of slavers across the globe and proved to be an effective method of decreasing the trade. Activists continued to push the government for more ships that could leverage Britain's imperial strength to fully end slavery. These warships provided muscle to Britain's abolitionist declarations and required significant expenditure on the part of the country. While anti-slavery gained increasing clout, pro-slavery interests continued to counteract and fight against anti-slavery activists. Some British investors placed large amounts of funds in American cotton and Cuban sugar plantations. Pro-slavery apologists worked to push the British populace to view slavery more favourably, or at least be indifferent to the reality of merchants' support of slave systems in other nations such as the United States or Brazil. When the American Civil War erupted over the question of slavery, certain British politicians favoured supporting the Confederate States of America in order to protect the clothing industry in Britain and to weaken the United States. In Liverpool, in particular, the home of the largest pro-slavery lobby in Great Britain, rallies and parties were held in support of the American South and their cause of protecting slavery. Ultimately, however, anti-slavery sentiment helped push the British government towards a solid neutrality during the American Civil War. Others pushed for imperial schemes to civilize African nations. While British conquests of African territories resulted in the ending of slavery across Africa, other problems arose from imperial ambitions. Yet it cannot be doubted that Britain leveraged its empire and large chunks of its national budget to fight against slavery. In 1851, British warships attacked the African kingdom of Lagos, in part because of its continued involvement in the slave trade. Following the abdication of Oba, or King Kosoko, British officials supported a new king who favoured anti-slavery. Other nations, including European nations, felt the pressure from the British Navy and government to abandon the practice. Furthermore, the people of Britain provided active support to American abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass, who toured Britain in the 1850s. What is more, it is a matter of fact that the British Empire and Britain itself invested more than any other nation in its efforts to completely end the slave trade, which was done out of a sense of morality and cost Britain millions of pounds to achieve, along with thousands of lives of British servicemen. Indeed, between 1807 and 1860, the West African